By the late 19th century, tenement and shanties with poor sanitation sprang up primarily in the inner city. The rich began a trek away from all that toward the suburbs, and the wealthy went even further out into gated estates to keep out the riffraff. A couple of terms that you probably need to understand the difference between. Rich means that you have more than a sufficient income. Wealth means refers to accumulated properties, investments, stocks, bonds, any kind of assets along those lines. Yet in the 1860 census, it revealed only 7.9% of the population received public assistance. Conditions changed little in the early 1900s. Many Southern blacks immigrated to the North, finding conditions in some cases worse than the ones they had left. Although they might have been hired as domestics, they had very minute wages. In Philadelphia, for example, African Americans made up only 4% of the population, but 8% of the destitute. Immigrants from Europe offered cheap labor for industrialization, a lot of infrastructure building, railroading, roads, that sort of thing. More than a century later, economic dislocation, legal and illegal immigrants, ethnic inequality, and the uncertainty of how to address those issues are still among us. The 20th century introduced quantitative measures, and social sciences and academics began the science of poverty. In the United States, researchers argued over minimum subsistence levels, and minimum comfort levels. Between 1909 and 1920, 43 states passed legislation requiring employers to pay workmen's compensation for persons injured at work, which was really the first organized social insurance program in the country. There was still concern for the welfare of women and children, and the Children's Bureau was formed in 1912 to collect information on child welfare, and the 1921 Shepard-Towner Act provided health education programs for mothers with babies. The period also created pension laws for widows, which kind of took away the stigma of charity. You know, it's money that my husband earned, and so it should come to me. By the 1920s, private and public charity gave way to social work, and colleges began to add programs. But then, the Great Depression. The stock market crashed, as I'm sure you know, in 1929. Between 1929 and 1933, unemployment quickly rose from 3.2% to 24.9%. By 1935, more than 20 million people were accepting aid, not necessarily because the government was kind and generous, but to alleviate the growing unrest in the country. By 1932, then President Franklin Delano Roosevelt knew the situation must change or the country would deteriorate into major social upheaval. Roosevelt and Congress created a series of agencies and acts to return the country to prosperity. Called the New Deal, it was essentially the nation's first set of entitlement programs. An entitlement is a guarantee of access to benefits based on established rights or by legislation. A right is an entitlement associated with a moral or social principle. Typically, entitlements are laws based on concepts of social equality, social justice, or enfranchisement, the right to vote. Some of the major programs of the New Deal included the Works Progress Administration, which created jobs, the National Labor Relations Acts, which gave unions the right to organize, Farm Security, which aided small farmers and migrant workers, the Federal Emergency Relief Act, which offered block grants to states. A block grant, if you don't know, is federal money that is given to the state as a lump sum, and then the state has the right to divide that money and pass it out among its citizens, however it sees fit. Social Security Act, pensions for the aged and unemployment insurance, aid to dependent children, The GI Bill of 1944, which offered disability, employment, education, and subsidized housing to 16 million World War II veterans. In the 1940s and 1950s, America was dubbed the affluent society with relative financial stability, except for the African Americans, the rural poor, Mexican Americans, Native Americans, and Puerto Ricans. But then, excuse me, the civil rights movement shattered the image of a homogeneous society. In 1962, writer Michael Harrington penned a book called The Culture of Poverty. Harrington claimed that poverty was an invisible land of the poor that existed in rural isolation or in crowded slums where middle-class visitors seldom ventured. Quote, that the poor are invisible is one of the most important things about them, he added. The work caught the attention of President John Kennedy, who pushed to create the 1962 Public Welfare Amendment to the Social Security Act, which increased federal benefits. His administration also created the Peace Corps and its domestic counterpart, Volunteers in Service to America, or VISTA. After President Kennedy was assassinated, Lyndon Johnson took the office and initiated a war on poverty under his Great Society Master Plan. If you're interested, you can access the link below and read more about the war on poverty. The war initiated a variety of new entitlement programs. Between 1963 and 1966, federal grants to the states more than doubled, with over 1 million cases added to the welfare rolls. By 1970, that had increased to 3.3 million. Johnson's plan started quite a few programs that are still around today. Work study, which I'm sure you're familiar with, at the Economic Opportunity Act, which provided job training, adult education, and loans to small businesses. Job Corps for school dropouts, which helped them train for jobs to earn a GED or find and keep a good position. Head Start, which promoted school readiness for children aged 3 to 5 in low-income families. The Food Stamp Act, which provided food assistance to mean any food or food product for human consumption except alcohol, tobacco, or things that were imported. Medicare for the elderly and disabled, and Medicaid for the poor. During the period, another movement arose, which is worth mentioning. Those were the community action programs. Some of them were funded with federal money. Most of these programs were developed on a grassroots level, and what grassroots means is that it starts from the people with the problem and then radiates out from there. So the best solutions to issues sometimes come from the people who are embroiled in those issues. It was a means whereby the poor could participate in formulating and administering their own local programs of social reform. Richard Nixon in 1968 was very critical of welfare across the board, but added the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act. The former, if you have children and you have a very small income and you're down as head of household, you can sometimes get back a larger refund than you actually paid in to the system. The Comprehensive Employment and Training Act subsidized public service jobs for the unemployed. The next president who impacted this situation greatly was Ronald Reagan, and Reagan created something called Reaganomics, which kind of took a slash and burn approach to entitlements, to any kind of welfare, to any kind of benefit system. He said he wanted to, quote, end the widespread freeloading that plagued the system. Yes, there are people who certainly misuse the welfare system. There are people who misuse food stamps. And there always will be people who break the rules, but there will always be people, unfortunately, who need help for a short time. And sometimes they can't manage at all without public assistance. Reagan cut taxes and increased military spending with the money saved from cutting the welfare budget. George H.W. Bush, the first President Bush, in 1988 helped pass the Family Support Act and the Jobs Program. This required single parents of children over 3 to work and get training in order to receive assistance. The program did provide the money for child care and transportation while the people were in training. Bill Clinton promised in 1966 to end welfare as we know it. He set up the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, abolished AFDC, and set a 2-year limit on welfare benefits. While the plan did increase employment among single mothers, their average annual earnings were only $8,000 to $12,000 a year. If you'll go back to our calculated amount, you will see that that was not necessarily financially, fiscally tenable. Some good things that did come out of Clinton's plan is that he made an effort to track down deadbeat dads, those men who abandon their family and don't send any financial help. He helped emphasize reducing teen pregnancy. He did say, however, that nearly 60% of people on welfare were not officially poor under current guidelines, and that assistance to the poor often comes at the expense of another. Passing Executive Order 12848 in 1993, which you can read if you care to. There's a link on the slide. Clinton said he was going to set up a federal plan to break the cycle of homelessness within a decade or so. Now, this was in 1993. In 2010, the Barack Obama administration unveiled a plan to end homelessness among some of society's most vulnerable groups within the next 10 years. Does this sound familiar? Obama's program is called Opening Doors. It is 74 pages. It wants to, first of all, end child and family homelessness, and then wipe out chronic homelessness. Chronic homelessness is someone who's been homeless for a year or more, and homelessness among veterans. And there's also a link to the Obama plan if you are interested in reading it. Some food for thought. Policymakers can raise requirements for high school or college graduate without funding the new demands. Educators can emphasize grammar skills without considering the vernacular that students bring to classes. Unruly students can be expelled to make the classroom safer, only to make the streets and the playgrounds less safe. City fathers can force the homeless out of public buildings to make them more appealing, but without offering affordable housing, the parks, the sidewalks, and vacant buildings fill with the homeless. Food for more thought. Philanthropic groups may set up soup kitchens without asking why in the land of plenty people are going hungry. Urban planners burn or bury garbage without considering the impact on the air and water supply. Reformers propose health care without asking why so many people are getting sick. Politicians can fund more prisons without considering poverty as a primary cause of crime.